Mike Jung, Karol Ruth Silverstein, and Natalia Sylvester. This talk is being pre-recorded and it will be available for replay. My name's Bryn Lopez. I'm the manager of Children's Book World in Los Angeles, where we celebrate diversity, knowledge, and enrichment through stories. It's a place where every reader sees themselves represented on our bookshelves and becomes a part of our book-loving community. Today, we're speaking with 4 authors whose books we are very proud to have on our bookshelves. Author Keah Brown is a journalist and freelance writer, activist, and advocate. She's written about living with cerebral palsy in Teen Vogue, Essence, Harper's, Bazaar, among other publications. Her debut essay collection, The Pretty One, was published in 2019. Her debut picture book, Sam Superseats from Kokila, was released this fall. We love this book. Her debut young adult novel, The Secret Summer Promise, is coming out in May from Levine Querido. How are you, Keah?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so excited to have you here today. Mike Jung is the author of the middle grade novels Geeks, Girls, and Secret Identities, Unidentified Suburban Object, and The Boys in the Back Row. Love that book. All from Arthur Levine and/or Levine Querido. Arthur Levine is going to be appearing, it seems like, in a lot of impactful ways with authors here today. His essays about mental health for young people and other important topics can be found in the anthologies Dear Teen Me, Break These Rules, 59 Reasons to Write, Don't Call Me Crazy, and The Hero Next Door. He is a founding member of We Need Diverse Books, which continues to greatly impact the publishing industry for the better. And we've got The Boys in the Back Room right there, a book that we love. Karol Ruth Silverstein writes all genres of children's literature and screenplays. She currently serves on the board of SCBWI Los Angeles and is a member of the Writers Guild of America West. Karol's debut young adult novel, Cursed, is loosely drawn from her experiences following a juvenile rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis at age 13. Her newest book, Stuck, Help Please, is part of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series for kids, and that is a board book that has recently come out, which is super exciting as well. And Natalia Sylvester was born in Lima, Peru. She is an award-winning writer of novels, essays, and poetry. Her debut book, Chasing the Sun, was named the best debut book of 2014 by Latinidad magazine. And Everyone Knows You Go Home won an International Latin Book Award. Her debut YA novel, Running, and her YA Breathe and Count Back are great sellers for us inside our store. We absolutely love them. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Bustle, Catapult, among other publications. We are so excited to have all 4 of you here for this conversation today. So the United Nations Day of Persons with Disabilities was established in 2021 to create advocacy for the leadership and participation of persons with disabilities toward an inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. Disability inclusion is an essential condition to upholding human rights, sustainable development, and peace and security. So their mission is something that I think is really important, but it's also something that I feel like the children's book industry has been working at for many, many years and is sort of on the front lines for doing a lot of this advocacy. I would love to talk to each of you in introducing yourselves about your lived experience. I should also mention, by the way, if you're hearing my voice, that I am a male who uses he, she, and I have a bald head with big, dark black glasses, and I'm wearing a black shirt, and I'm here to talk to you in conversation with these authors. And we'll start with Mike and work our way through the authors here. Mike, do you want to?
Oh, sure. Do I want to start? Yeah, I'll say yes. Hi, my name is Mike Jung. I am a Korean American man. People tell me I'm taller than they expect, but you can't tell because it's just my head and shoulders on this podcast. I have short black hair. I'm wearing a pair of less bulky glasses than Brand's. Black T-shirt from the bookstore at the end of the world. Black hoodie. What else was I supposed to say? I've totally forgotten. I'm a little spacey.
Well, really, we'd love to hear about your writing. Just quickly about your lived experience and.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, I have 3 middle grade books out, and I've written a few stories and anthology things, also for middle grade, but also for different age readers. And I'm autistic. But it's not something that I knew for the majority of my life. I knew always that there were ways in which I felt different from, most or a lot of people around me. But I was born in 1969, and so when I was a child and a teenager, there was very little in the way of understanding about what it means to be autistic and what it means to navigate the world and how to actually embrace and support people who are autistic. And so I didn't know. No one around me knew. There was a dearth of clinical knowledge, and so I struggled in just so many different ways. And it wasn't until I was in my mid 40s, mid 40s, yeah, when a child in my life was being assessed for neurodivergence and was diagnosed as autistic, my oldest child. And so when we were doing all that research, and there is more information now. Some of it is actually good. And reading it, I started to think like, oh yeah, I do that too. Oh yeah, that sounds like something that happens to me. I was resistant to actually the idea that that our daughter could be autistic. And so, I had a lot of internalized ableism in that way that I had to overcome in order to simply accept that possibility. But once I did, it became very obvious, and my understanding is this is how it happens for a lot of people, that we were doing the research for her, but it also applied just as much to me because I recognized so much of myself and what I was seeing and what I was hearing. An interesting thing with my books is that, I do tend to write about these sort of underdog kids who have like a tight friend group, but are in some ways outsiders and excluded. And none of my novels feature characters who are explicitly on the page autistic. I actually had just, sort of by default written them thinking that they were neurotypical. But autistic readers, both adults and kids, have said to me that I know that your characters, you don't say that they're autistic, but they are, right? And I thought, oh, that's very interesting, because I guess the truth comes out, even though I didn't really know it, because my novels, each of them, I started writing before I was diagnosed, before I really knew that, really important truth about myself. That is changing now, because now I am starting to write characters that are like explicitly super openly autistic on the page, which feels like a really good change, because understanding, like when I'm not a believer that everybody actually needs to have this a clinical diagnosis, an external validation about this knowledge about themselves. I guess I need it in some ways, because when I was diagnosed, it felt like the biggest light bulb in my head, of all the many little light bulbs in my head, had lit up, and I had what felt like possibly the most profound and significant new piece of self-knowledge that I had ever had, and it recast my understanding of self, and it recast my perceptions and understandings of so many aspects of my life, going all the way back to the beginning. It felt like an enormous weight being lifted off, because I felt like, oh, this is something I understand about myself. I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not actually making mistakes or being incompetent or being a fool in some way. It is that my neurology functions differently, and that I'm disabled. And there's an explanation. There's an explanation for these things, and it felt and feels so empowering. And so,
well, Mike,
sorry.
That's okay. I was going to say, I think that that's the benefit of us as readers, and for the kids who clearly, I think there's a thing within marginalized communities around the world, when you do not see yourself often in books, identified in your books, that you have a way of being able to secretly find them and search them out. I think we lost Mike, but I think he'll come right back on in just a second. So, but you know what I'm saying, when you actually see, you hunt for yourself in anything that you can, and you can find that. Let's go to Keah. And Keah, if you can tell us about yourself, and also about your books as well.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Keah. I'm currently wearing a pink shirt, red lipstick, and black and white glasses. I think they're mostly like black and clear, but you get the vibes. I am a writer of all things. I write nonfiction, I write fiction, I'm working on a screenplay, and I am a Black woman with cerebral palsy. And I'm desperate, 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 desperate to see myself and people like me on the page, which is why I explicitly write. Hi again. I explicitly write characters that are disabled, at least so far. I think there's something to being your own representation. Like you said, we spend so much time as marginalized people trying to find bits and pieces of ourselves and people that look nothing like us, nor share our experiences, that for me, it's really nice to create characters and people and worlds where we not only like live, but we thrive. And so a lot of the work that I do, whether it's nonfiction like The Pretty One was, which is my first book of essays that came out in 2019. So I wrote about my life and pop culture and all the things that matter to me, all the way through to The Secrets of My Promise that's out in May. I really wanted to make sure that I took the time to write and tell stories about disabled Black people specifically, because I had never seen myself represented. And I honestly got so tired of waiting. So what I wanted to do with Sam Superseat specifically was reach kids and let them know very early on that there's nothing wrong with you, that you don't have to change yourself, that rest can be an adventure, and it can be exciting to just really listen to your body. And I wanted to create a character like Sam who loved seats as much as I do and gave them personalities and thoughts and ideas so that she could have fun with her friends and her parents. I really wanted to make joy the center of this book, and I hope I did.
You sure did. It's a very joyful book, and it's one of the reasons why we love it. And we'll go into more things. I want to talk to you about also that village of support that Sam has inside her book, which is inside her life, which is so important as well. Let's go to Natalia and have Natalia talk to us about her experiences and then her writing as well.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here in conversation with all of you. I am Natalia. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Latina woman with light brown skin, brown hair, brown eyes. I'm wearing my hair in a side braid and very long beaded earrings that I cannot help but always wear, even when I have these headphones on. But so I was born with hip dysplasia. I was born in Lima, Peru, and I came to the US when I was 4. And even before I moved, I'd had many surgeries. I don't actually know exactly how many. The ones I remember, I've had 5. So I grew up as a child in and out of surgeries, often in a cast for several weeks, also using mobility aids as I recovered. And it took me a very long time to identify as disabled. And I know it's because of the ableism we internalize. And, I actually, Breathing Count Back from 10 is my first book that really, I feel I was writing from all the parts of myself that make me whole, versus I feel like sometimes we tend to fragment pieces of ourselves when we don't see each other fully represented in the media and the art that we consume. And so I'm just so excited to speak with you all, because I think it's interesting, hearing about, Mike, you mentioned you didn't know your diagnosis until you were much older. I was born with mine, and there's actually a line in Breathing Count Back from 10 in which Veronica says, "I'm okay in my body. It's my body in the world that's not." And that's something that I felt for a really long time. Well, for a short time, I really thought being in surgeries, going through everything that I did, like being homeschooled for some time, even just the ways that I could or could not move, to me, that was my normal. And I say normal in air quotes because it's not a word that I like, right? But the point of it being that I just felt that everyone probably has different experiences in their bodies, and this one was mine, and I didn't place any judgment on it. I just embraced it as my own. And it wasn't really until I kind of stepped out of that bubble and starting school as an immigrant kid in the US who was now suddenly being bullied for the way she walked, for the way she talked, for what she could and couldn't do when PE came around, which was just so incredibly traumatizing. That's really when I started to then internalize all that judgment on my, towards my body, and no longer feel right in it. And what I hope to do with my books now is just make it so, help other kids never have to deal with that. I hid so many parts of myself. Even the scars that I had from surgeries, I had all these tricks that I would do in order to, hope that no one would see them. And to go from that to then actually sending the design team pictures of my scars to make sure that they are prominently on the cover of Breathing Camp Bag from 10. It's just a real journey. And I don't know that I would have gotten there without finding, a community of fellow disabled writers who were really unapologetically self-identifying and making me realize that actually this is my experience too, and I don't have to, it's not like I'm not disabled enough. It's not like just because I didn't self-identify before, it doesn't mean it's, I'm any less than, but also helping me realize that I had a lot to unpack in order to tell this story in a way that could maybe, hopefully, no longer perpetuate the same harm that I experienced.
Karol?
Yes. I've been listening to all these really interesting life stories and wonderful authors talking about their work. So I'm Karol. I'm a white lady in my 50s. I have shoulder length, wavy brown hair. I am wearing a blue Disability Pride t-shirt and dark blue chunky glasses. I think I'm sort of definitely closer to Bryn's chunky glasses than Mike's less chunky glasses. And I'm coming to you from my lovingly cluttered home office, where you will see mobiles dangling and stuff like that. And there may or may not be a pussycat photo bomb. I'm just warning you. Because I got two, and they have a tendency to want to be on camera. So I was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis at 13. And something that's not in a lot of my bios is that I grew up as an overweight kid before then, and I was really bullied badly, and I felt bodily different than, the kids in my school. And I lost weight at fat camp, and I was so prepared to be this new person, and at the very least not to stick out for the wrong reasons. And I was diagnosed about 6 months later. And suddenly I was sort of teased and left out because I walked funny and I grimaced when I walked, because arthritis is extremely physically painful. And especially in the early days when you're trying to get your medication sorted out and stuff like that. And as predicted, here comes my white cat, Boo. Just on cue, baby. This is Boo. He's very furry. There's a lot of fur here. All right, tail down. So when I started out as a screenwriter, I had just enough success to keep me hopeful, but no kind of real breakthroughs. And somewhere along the line, someone suggested, hey, have you thought about adapting your scripts into books for kids? Because I had a tendency to write about young people and young girls in particular, which in Hollywood, if there's not IP, if it's not based on a popular book or something, young girls tend to not be the focus. So I remembered that I read voraciously as a kid and just loved children's books, and I started reading the kind of books that were being published at that point, which was like late 90s. And I thought, this is amazing. I definitely want to be a part of this. So I sort of learned that craft, and it took me a long time to finally get that book sale. But I had been recommended, it's been recommended to me to write about my experience of getting sick at 13. And I really didn't want to do it at first. And I really couldn't do it until I heard the character's voice. And part of the reason was we have a lot of the disability stories out there in film and in books and on television that are what we lovingly refer to as inspiration porn, which is just these sort of feel-good stories where, look at this brave disabled person and it makes us feel better about ourselves. That's sort of the able-bodied take. And I know there are plenty of kids who get sick or were born with disabilities that handle it with grace and dignity. And I was not one of those kids. I was angry. I was pissed off at the world. I felt sorry for myself. I was, just difficult. Now he's going to knock down the light. Oh my God, my cat. And I hadn't seen my story. I hadn't seen a messy, pissed off kid who's at odds with her family and just really, really struggled. And I wanted to tell that story. And if I couldn't find a way into that story, it wasn't worth it to me to write it. And I sort of heard Ricky's voice first in a writing exercise, and then I was able to write her. My book has a lot of internalized ableism in it. In fact, it has too much for some readers. And the reason I did that is because I grew up not really having much experience with disability. So I, picked up the thoughts and feelings around disability that most people in society had. And it was really tough for me when I became sick, and I hid it for a long time. Kids would ask me, why are you limping? I said, oh, I twisted my ankle. Like, to have arthritis too as a little kid was just really embarrassing. And when I was 21, I had my first joint replacement surgery. I've had 12 hip replacements, long story. And I spent a month rehabbing from that first knee replacement and really learning how to be a disabled person in the world. And that was when I first started identifying as disabled. And it was really an empowering moment for me. Sort of like Mike, it was like, not that I didn't think there was anything wrong with me suddenly, but it was just like I had people, and I really, I think it was just an empowering thing to say, yes, I'm disabled, hear me roar, right? And my pronouns, are she, her, but I also add disabled, because I feel like when we share our pronouns, we're letting people know how we identify, right? We're letting people know what words to use if you're talking, about us, to refer to us. You use the she, her for me, but you also use disabled, because that's, hashtag say the word, that's the word I use. And it's been mostly empowering. Now I'm working on a new book, and there is a disabled character in it. She's the main human character, because the main character is a cat. And she is disabled, but it's not a diagnosis story, because I did that in Cursed, and I think they're important. But I love the idea of disabled joy, and a character who's disabled but also has some goal that is not necessarily related to her disability. Her disability may provide, conflicts and issues she's got to navigate that maybe an able-bodied kid wouldn't face, but it's not her main focus isn't suffering from her disability and struggling for acceptance. And that's what I hope to put more stories like that into the world.
So I think that there's this common thing too with all of your characters, Ricky, Matt and Eric, Sam, Veronica, that they are so real to readers when they're actually reading them, in terms of their anger, their emotional dealings with the different situations, or their joy. All of those aspects are part of the stories that are being told. Now, before I go, one thing I want to talk about, but with Natalia, you wrote in the beginning of your book an introduction, which I thought was really, really important, where you said, this is your story. The story you're telling, not your personal story, but this is one story that is being told. Because I think a lot of times, as you've all said, people think that, oh, well, that's not my story, so it's not a real story because it doesn't identify with what my lived experience was. And I really honor that all of you speak to the fact that this is just this is your experience that you've actually had. And I want to talk about the emotions of your characters, the humor and the joy. Why is that such an important part of differently abled readers seeing that as being an essential part of somebody living with a disability, a person with a disability?
I know for me with Sam, I wanted her to have joy and excitement and eagerness because I didn't have it at her age. Like at her age, I constantly wanted to keep going and I liked playing with my cousins, but I was very angry at the world, like Karol said she was. I just think I wanted her to have what I didn't have in terms of her being a fully realized child who understood herself and she could ask for what she needs and she could be excited about things because I felt like oftentimes when you see stories about disability, they're so sad and drab and everything's miserable and God, their lives suck and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, no, Sam has a village of people who love her and she loves herself. And to me, that was so important because I wanted to create a story that I didn't have. I wanted kids to look at her and say, yeah, Sam's disabled, but I also love her because we have the same, taste in clothes or colors or I also love my mom and my best friends. I also love going back to school shopping and friendship bracelets and I have a super seat or maybe I can get one and like I wanted her to be in many ways aspirational and so it was really important for me to have her have joy while also being honest about the way she feels like when her leg starts to hurt and she's upset that she has to take a rest and take a moment to like really listen to her body. And there's a point in the book where I have them all sitting down on the mall bench and she says, hey, like I only need a few more minutes. And one of her friends says, like, it's fine, relax. Like I like people watching. I wanted that particularly in there because I wanted to show that it's not always that kids are going to tear you down and make fun of you, but you can build a community with kids who understand what you need. Nobody ever made her feel small or weird or uncomfortable about needing rest. And I think that to me was like a utopia because I've never experienced that as a child where I wasn't being made fun of for needing rest or walking with a limp or being disabled or talking about cerebral palsy. So I wanted to give what I didn't have to this character and allow her to have the joy that I sort of missed out on.
And you're modeling to kids also that behavior about being a friend, which I think is so important. I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt earlier.
Yeah, and what Keah has been talking about reminds me of something that I heard from one of my favorite YA authors, who's Sonia Soanes, who's local. And she talks about the fun of writing YA, and I think it could be transferred to all kids, is that we get to have our characters make the same mistakes we made, but we get to have them kind of correct them a little better or a little quicker or a little more thoroughly. And so I've always loved that idea. And in Cursed, I knew that I had to give the reading audience like a bit of a break from her anger because it's a lot and it's like too much still for some people. So I wanted to have her be very sarcastic and funny and have a lot of humor in it. And she also gets great joy out of singing and music, which is also drawn from me because I also get great joy out of that. So there's some, respite for her when she's just so angry and overwhelmed. She can kind of listen to her music and feel her bliss and take her hot baths. But I sent her on a journey from feeling damaged and cursed to some semblance of acceptance of where she was, this new version of her life, and figuring out who she was going to be under these new circumstances. In my life, it took me about 25 years. So I got to have Ricky make that journey and find her people and find her voice and figure out who she was going to be in the world under her new circumstances in about 6 months. So it might be a little unrealistic, but that was the joy of providing, a mirror for kids that are going through similar things. They didn't have to take 25 years like I did. They could sort of get there through exposure to books like mine and books like all of the authors here in this panel create. So that was really a great thing to be able to put in the humor, put in some joy, and have her come to some self-acceptance by the end.
Mike, humorous. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Natalia.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, Karol, I love that you mentioned that because that idea of, the character maybe taking a little less time, or a lot in my case too, to realize the things that you realize. It's like, because I wonder, so we're all writing from lived experiences, but then we've also crafted these stories, and that they have like their own characters, they have their own plot, their own, like there's just, you're creating a whole world that even when it's rooted in yours is still its own world. And I often will tell people, like, Veronica realizes in one summer a lot of things that took me years to realize. But she had things that maybe I didn't. Like, she had like these really supportive best friends who just encouraged her and everything and never make her feel ashamed in her body. She has this theme park where there's underwater mermaids that perform, and they have auditions, and now she wants to audition even though her parents are not a fan. She ends up auditioning not as a way to overcome, her disability, but really as a way to say, this is another way I see myself. This is a true part of me that where I find joy, where I have a passion, where I have a dream, for how I feel most free underwater. And she wants to be a part of that. And she just wants the version of herself that she knows to be true to align more with the way others around her treat her, when it comes to her parents, and when it comes to people who aren't necessarily as, friends of hers, that don't accept her as she is. And one of the things that she is also, each chapter in the book starts with a definition of a word. And then like the first definition is actually the definition you'd find in the dictionary. And then the second definition is Veronica's version of the word and how she writes it. And it's really because, the first time I saw my medical records as an adult, I thought I would get answers about my body from it. And what I found is actually it was like hearing someone talk to me about my body in a way that didn't match up at all with the language that I would have used to tell my own story. And so Veronica is like reclaiming a lot of that, and she's reclaiming it through story, and she's reclaiming it through language. I personally, like, Bryn, you mentioned, that we're all learning here and stuff. Like, I don't use differently abled because disability is not a bad word, and oftentimes we have euphemisms that are put upon us, right? That I feel make able-bodied people more comfortable, but not necessarily us. And so I think all of these things are about how are we constantly learning and evolving, but also who is having the power to tell our stories. And I think it's so powerful that we're all here because we are telling our stories from, characters who have been through what we've been through.
Mike, in your book, you use humor a lot, obviously, with the characters, which I think is really important to their survival day to day. But what I really loved about your book was, we use the term male toxicity, but really the ability for two friends, particularly boys, to love each other in a platonic way, or whatever way, but just to actually be able to express their love for each other in a way that supported each other both emotionally and mentally. And why was that important for you in your books to be able to portray that?
I mean, it's for so many reasons. People tell me that my books are funny, and I do try to make humor part of my work because it is both an important coping mechanism for me, but it is also has over time just become part of how I express my thoughts about existing and the world that we live in. The way that I write is it's sort of an interesting mix. It's not entirely grounded in my own experiences when I was young, because like a lot of us, my childhood, I felt constantly and horrifically bullied. I felt excluded to the point of feeling completely alone, no matter how many people were around me or what kind of activity I might have been engaged in with who. It was difficult. It was difficult and traumatic to be a child, is how it felt to me. Yes. And it didn't feel like it's sometimes difficult for me to pinpoint moments of joy. I did have them, there were relationships and friendships that I had that sustained me on some level. None of them were necessarily on the level of like the kind of friendship that Matt and Eric have in Boys. Although that friendship is actually modeled on a real friendship of mine from high school. And Eric is modeled against my old high school friend Chris, who we were very tight, and we did spend a lot of time with each other. And he is one of the reasons I survived high school, because it was not hard to imagine a reality in which I had decided to stop surviving. And Chris is one of the people who got me through that. And he is, of course, his name's Chris Leopoulos, and of course, so now he's actually working in children's literature himself, and illustrates books, and is doing graphic novels of his own. And so I lost touch with him for about 30 years, and then we reconnected on Twitter after a friend of ours had passed away too young, and that helped me to sort of, again, like, recast like my feelings about that time in my life, and realize, okay, it was lonely. It was horrendously lonely, and it was painful, and I do carry the marks of trauma in my mind and my body. And have always, but there were moments of brightness. There were moments of joy. There were people who did sustain me for, even just for a moment, even just for a short period of time. And my thoughts and feelings about my childhood has always been about the things that I missed out on, right? The experiences I didn't have because I was excluded, because I didn't know how to interact with people and talk to people, because I didn't know how to be a social being in a world that did not want to include autistic people in it, even if it wasn't understood explicitly in those terms. My childhood always felt incomplete. And one of the reasons why I try very hard to include joy and humor and laughter is that those things are so much more a part of my life now, because I did find my way through to the other side of a very, very, very long, hard, dark period in which I wasn't sure I wanted to continue. And my life feels so much more whole now than it did back then. And I'm writing the books now. I am a grown ass man in my 50s, and I'm writing the books now. And I am writing it with all of myself, meaning I am writing a book for kids. I am writing a book about kids, but I am writing it as me, Mike Jung, and all of those emotional states that I experience now, all those kinds of experiences that I have now, where I am startled by them, really, by, like, there are moments when I just cannot believe that I have as much joy in my life as I do now. And I want that to be part of my process of writing, because, I do write for myself first. Like the books, ultimately, the process of writing and publishing the books and getting them out there is to actually put them out there for readers. That is the end goal. But it starts with, like, I got to write a book that I feel right with. I got to write a book that feels good to me, or that feels real to me. Or if it doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel good in a real and meaningful sort of way. But I do want them to feel good. And I want my characters to have, like, whole life experiences in a way that I feel like I wasn't able to have, which is, like, I guess, a different way of saying what Keah was saying. And humor has always felt like just sort of in a way, kind of how a lot of what I say comes out as, and so I have tried to cultivate that kind of voice. And it is partly like, oh, people like that, and I like it when people like that, and maybe there's like a codependent sort of needy thing there, like I need love me, and if I can make you laugh, you will love me, and then I'll be more loved. And I don't know that it's entirely healthy, but it is a joyful part of the process for me when I'm writing, to be able to write in that sort of voice. So I could go on for another 3 days about that, but I'll stop now.
Well, I think that it's interesting that all of you have, spoken about, I don't want to call it telling your story, or telling a version of aspects of your story in a way that are not just a survival guide, but the potential and possibilities that exist that maybe you didn't necessarily have, but that other kids could have. And you're not just modeling their behavior, but also the behavior of the people who interact with them as well, which I think is such an essential part of it as well.
Oh, can I jump back in for 1 minute? Sorry. Um, I also just realized that like it's not just that I want to for my characters to have these sort of whole, multifaceted, joyful life experiences. There are a lot of autistic kids in my life now, and they do have lives like that. They do have support, and they do have resources, and they do have adults and families who are there for them in the ways that like people either were unwilling or unable to be there for me. And so when I look at those kids in my life, I admittedly say like, oh, golden raw material. It's gold. They're watching you like go through life in this whole and joyful way. But it is also like I can see that it's real.
So one of the things that is important for me that and tying this in with the UN and what they do is that a lot of their mission is about communities around the world. And so many marginalized communities have populations of persons living with disabilities that have different lived experiences than we may actually have here in the United States, which I think is important. But also the way different cultures deal with disability within a specific community. And I don't mean it in terms of a country identification, but more of a, if we're talking about Asian American community or African American community or Latino American or Latin American community, the way families may actually deal with disability is very different. And so does that inform your writing in any way for you as individuals? And is that an important part to include in your writing, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, speaking for myself, shout out to my mom, because she never did the thing that some parents do where they're like, oh no, you're disabled, let me coddle you, gotta make sure that you can you do this okay? Can you zip that up? Do you need help? Like, my mom was very much like, we are going to find a way around whatever it is you need to do. You want to ride a bike? We'll find a bike you can ride. You want to try roller skates? Great. You want to do X, Y, and Z? You can do it just like your twin sister can do it. You'll just do it differently. And I didn't realize until I was older how rare that is, and also how nice it is, because she never made me feel like I was a burden to her or the family dynamic, or and I never felt like I had to prove myself in some way to her. And so what really helped me feel like a decent person, even when I felt like shit myself, was that at least I know I can go home and have a supportive mom who is going to try to help me in every way she can to be the best version of myself, and will find ways to adapt to the world around me. She was never one of those moms that was like, I don't think you can do it, or I'm scared for you to do it because you're disabled. She was like, no, you can do it, and we'll just figure out how. And so for me, every book that I write that involves a parent, I'm going to be that girl that's like, they'll have at least one supportive parent. So like in my next book, my character Andrea is very close to her parents, and they're very much like my mom. I modeled them both after my mom and her ability to be like, we'll find a workaround, we'll figure it out, because too many times my friends who are disabled as well were like, oh no, my parents just were like sheltering me, and they very much were like, we don't want you to try it because it's dangerous, or we don't want you to do X, Y, and Z, or we don't believe that you can. So for me, it was like having that role model from 1991 on was just like, okay, good. I'm going to give that representation because I don't see it enough. And especially because I think it's really weird that parents do that. And I wish they would stop assuming that their kids can't do whatever it is they set their mind to just because it looks different than what they think it should look like. And so I wanted to make sure that I personally, in my community, especially as a Black woman, allowed the world to see that Black parents can also just be supportive and eager for you to see the world as much as you want to see it.
Nice. In my case, and I address this somewhat in my book as well, I was diagnosed at 13. My parents were kind of a mess at that point. They were sort of fairly newly divorced and had all their emotional crap they were dealing with around that. And it was an adjustment for each of us. So it was a huge adjustment for me to have this diagnosis, and I didn't know what my future would be, and I'm in horrible pain. And for my parents, they were like, oh my God, our daughter has this disease. She's likely going to become crippled. She's in pain. I don't know how to help. I don't know how to fix this. This changes, what I thought her future was going to be, and my future as her parent. So we all had to adjust to that diagnosis. There wasn't something, I'm sure that parents who have children who are disabled from birth, they have an adjustment period. They're not only adjusting to being parents and having an infant, but also all those sort of expectations that they had, have to shift a little bit. But interestingly, here are my parents dealing with licking their own wounds from having broken up. And then suddenly their kid has this crisis, and she's pissed off at the world. I definitely felt like it was sort of every woman for herself in my family. I have 2 older sisters, and the 3 of us lived with my mom, while my dad was sort of living the bachelor lifestyle. And we were all really, really just struggling. So it is definitely an adjustment for the people around us. And like with Ricky, coming to her self-acceptance a lot quicker than I did, her parents in the book come to understand how to best be supportive a lot quicker than my parents did. Shout out to my parents, they're great, but it was tough. It's a big adjustment.
Yeah, I often say that I don't know that I could have ever written this story without it also being through an immigrant and Latinx lens, because that's how I experienced my body. And those things are so interconnected, and I think that we don't talk enough about that, the way that cultural influences, background, race, religion, wealth or lack of, all those things are going to really affect the ways that your story unfolds. And so like in Veronica's case, she's not just dealing with, wanting to pursue her dreams and kind of going against her parents' wishes of what they think the American dream is. And I say that in quotes. They have this very narrow idea of what success looks like for her, and it doesn't really match up with her mermaid dreams. But there's also elements like sexism, machismo, that are very much very shaped by her culture. She is a Latina, she's a disabled immigrant, and she is not only sometimes infantilized and not given full agency over her body, but then at the same time, she is falling in love for the first time. She's discovering her sexuality in a way that she hopes will feel safe. But she is shamed by her parents for being what they call promiscuous when she's just exploring her body. And I was really interested in seeing and kind of exploring this intersection between what it means, because as disabled people, we are often desexualized, but as a Latina, Veronica is over-sexualized and made to feel shame. And all of it at the end really equates to her having to carry shame that is thrust upon her and how she feels in her body. And so the other thing that I found really interesting is also, going back to this idea of not just sexual consent, which is something that I also explore, because disabled people, we are more vulnerable to sexual assault than a lot of other, segments of the population. But I was really interested in also like medical consent, like who gets to have the final say over her body. And I don't, this is not, I don't want to overgeneralize, but in my experience, in my community, there is an awful lot of authority placed on doctors, as if, they're just put on this hugely high pedestal. There's this, like, it's always like, oh, el doctor dijo, like, the doctor said, and it's like the final word. And even her parents don't question that. And so then she learns not to question that. And through the course of the story, she has to learn to actually speak up for her own body. So all of these things are just, it wouldn't, the story simply would not exist if I wasn't trying to bring all these parts of her and have them come together organically.
I'll jump in now. What was I going to say? I'm sorry. I get very caught up in listening to the three of you talk, and I'm just like, oh, she's fabulous. Oh man, that is brilliant. Like, oh, that's really good. That really resonates. And then I lose my own, train of thought, which is only moving a couple miles an hour to begin with. So I am the child of Korean immigrants. My parents both immigrated from Korea to the Los Angeles area in the 1960s, and um, the way I also don't want to generalize, the way that my extended Korean American family understands and confronts or doesn't confront neurological disability is super messy. There is an immense amount of stigma, and that's not, certainly not unique to my family or to, Koreans and Korean Americans at all. But there is a specific sort of I don't know. There's a sort of shame and stigma that I feel like has always been attached to it amongst like the Korean American communities that I've moved through, that I've known through my family, and so that has always been very difficult, and was, I think, one of the huge, really big impediments to me actually coming to the place of self-knowledge that I'm in right now. Again, not the only one, but one of them. I saw my mom on Friday night, stayed at her place. It was very nice. We have a much better relationship than we used to. But there are still things that it's very hard to talk about for assorted reasons. And one of the things that's very hard for her to talk about is actually matters of mental health, because nobody's bigger on doctors than a family of Korean immigrants. But and there's so many in my family. But when we talk about mental health, it's an entirely different thing. And my mom has actually, in a moment of rare candor, said to me, like, I would never be able to go to therapy. Like, I would never do that. And I'm married to a therapist, so it's kind of a big part of my life, and I've spent years going to therapy myself. So there's a major disconnect in that way. And I imagine at some point that I will write a book that that includes those dynamics, the way that they happened with my family during my childhood. But it's just not what I want to do right now, because as I've journeyed through life and as I've been able to meet more people, and I know so many more really progressive Korean American and Asian American families now than I did. That's not really the case for my family, and that has been like sort of a constant. It's constant state of sort of wonder I'm in about that. Like, wow, really? And I try to do that myself as a parent, and that's the representation of parenthood, Asian American parenthood, that I want in my books, because again, it feels as real as the experience that I had as a child, but it also feels much more current. It also feels much more, again, like what the autistic children that I know, and not just in my family, are experiencing now. And it gives me inroads to sort of explore different stories in a different way than I would if I was writing exclusively through this other sort of more repressed sort of lens. And it is part of the issue of wanting that representation out there, because I do feel like there's so many stereotypes about just what it is to be a Korean American parent. And it's like, no, we're out here doing things in a lot of different ways, and the ways that I'm doing it and the ways that the other parents that in my life who I rely on and trust and talk to are doing it is just as valid, and in some ways better. I don't want to say, a little better, and I want that to be the part of the stories I write, because it feels so vital, and it also feels important.
Oh, you're muted.
I want to bring us into our last topic. We've got a short period of time before we finish up, but in looking at the world today, we see people like Ali Stroker on Broadway, who's made such an inroad there into that world. We see Daniel Durant on Dancing with the Stars making such an impact in his. All four of you are those same type of stars as those, because you are impacting readers, young readers, with your stories. So I would like to finish up by asking each of you to relay a story about someone you have met, a child who read your book or read your story, who you impacted, and what was that feeling like when you talked to that person? We'll start with Natalia.
Oh my God, it's hard to pick one. I get a lot of messages from readers who are disabled and who are immigrants, who say they see themselves in the book. But I will say one of the things that really stood out was there was one reader who told me that they never thought they would see a book in which a character describes how chewing gum reminds them of anesthesia. And the reason that really hit me so much is because I wrote that because, in Breathing Count Back from 10, Veronica has a love interest, Alex, and there's one point where he's chewing a gum that reminds her of the smell of anesthesia, and she tells him that. And that was actually taken from my own experience. I had a boyfriend in high school who had the same thing. I never told him that. So a lot of times I'm like voicing things through this book, but I almost didn't put it in there because I just thought it's way too specific and who would ever care? Like I really was convinced that my experience, because I hadn't seen it, reflected in books, I just thought I felt very alone in it. And I just thought maybe it didn't matter as much. And so every time a reader tells me that it did resonate and that they do see themselves in it's actually like having another reflection back at me to remind me, like, no, you actually were never alone. And I think that's just really powerful, and I'm so grateful for it.
That's good. I'm going to go to Mike next because he might have to leave us before, but yeah.
Oh yeah, the response I'm thinking about wasn't from one of my novels, but was from my essay in Don't Call Me Crazy, which was nonfiction and for teen readers. And that was the first published thing I wrote, actually, that's about my experience as an autistic person. I talked about like how revelatory that knowledge was coming at the point in my life that it did. And a friend of mine, Taslin Magnuson, who's a poet and an activist and a great person, was talking to me about her son, and they were going through a rough period, and she brought that book to him, and specifically, oh no, actually she didn't yet because it hadn't been published. I sent them the story before it actually been edited or published or anything. They saw a very advanced version of that essay, and it apparently was very helpful to him, and gave him a level of insight that she said that he was not aware of before. And I got to meet them at an event later that year, and he was there, and he apparently wanted to meet me, which was not the typical thing. And I felt like, and so I was there, and we're both like not looking each other in the eye and not really saying much, and we're both like stimming and whatnot. And I just thought, wow, I see this boy like for who he really is, and he came here to see me. That really continues to mean the world to me.
That's great. Karol?
I've heard, off and on from readers. There was one who, people feel like I really nailed the pain of having arthritis. Arthritis is specifically very physically painful. So people appreciate that I really put that on the page. But there was one story, it was someone my editor knew who put me in touch with her, and she did volunteer work at a home where a number of disabled kids lived, and they had different emotional problems on top of their disabilities some of the time. And there was one kid who was really hard to reach, and she had multiple disabilities, and she also had to use sign language to communicate, and she just had a lot going on, and she was very angry and very hard to reach. And this woman gave her my book, and she just described how the kid was telling her, through tears and saying, "I've never felt so seen." And the book meant so much to her. And then they had like a little book club in the place where she lived, and she presented, it was the first time that she had the courage, and the desire to be someone who brought a book to the group. And she spoke to the group about the book and how much it meant to her. And this woman who was communicating all this to me, using a pseudonym, so she protected the kid's privacy and everything, she was just so grateful that something reached this kid. So there was like a double layer of, I reached this kid, and the kid really had never seen something she related to so much. And I think her disabilities were not, were very different than mine, but the anger is what, I've had people say, I'm so grateful that you let her be angry like that. So I had touched this reader, and then I'd also touched this volunteer who, was at such a loss, and then was able to, through my book, reach this kid that was so hard to reach. So that was one of my favorite little reader stories.
That's great. Keah?
After Sam Supersedes came out, I got this email from a parent who said that her son, I don't even remember what disability he had. But he was like this really adorable little kid with this cute little haircut. And she said they had read Sam Supersedes every single night for 2 weeks. And then they went around their house and they named all of their chairs special names and gave them personalities. And it was like, it made me weep, because I never would have guessed that people would actively, like that a child would want to read it every day, every night for 2 weeks. Like I was like, my book that I wrote, what? And so I get emails like those, and then also with the pretty one, like I'm friends with Selma Blair. We met because I did a cover story on her for Town and Country magazine. And one of the first things she said to me when we sat down for the interview was, I read your book all in one day. And I, like, to me, whenever anybody's like, I read your book quickly, or like I really liked it, or I returned to it, those to me are the hugest compliments, because I'm like, I dog ear books all the time. Like, my favorite thing is to reread a book. And so those sorts of things are the things that like really keep me going and let me know that I'm doing something right.
Yeah. I want to thank you all, because I want, with the world of children's books, I sort of spoke with this about Mike before we actually all got together. But the reason I'm a bookseller is because I'm a professional bookseller. I've done it for 30 years, is because I get to share these wonderful stories that you all have written. And I feel like we're all on the front lines of creating change within the world in every way and form. And so much of the desire to get rid of kids' books is because of that change, because of that honesty about community, about cultures, about situations. But you all four of you and others, are warriors of self-determination. You are out there writing your individual stories, and it's because of you that these fights are going on. And thank God you are there to be able to give us the tools to be able to continue to lift kids up, lift their families up and their stories. So I cannot thank you all enough for sharing your stories on the page, but also sharing your stories here with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bryn.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So this conversation has been recorded. You will be able to watch it in your communities and in your classrooms and your libraries as long as you would like to be able to have it. And again, I thank all of you for participating today. And I hope you all have a great the end of 2022 and a great 2023.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Been an honor. Bye.